Okay, hello everybody. This is going to be a video lecture on the subject of the Enlightenment. Um, it's We've been working through a unit which is kind of about cultural history, where I'm really focusing mostly on religion. Um, we've had a unit on the history of science really, really briefly, which was kind of intellectual history, and a lot of what we're doing here is going to kind of blur those categories or blend those categories together a little bit. The sort of intellectual aspect of things, not now so much in terms of science, although we'll see that coming in, but in terms of other areas like philosophy and political thinking and a few other areas of intellectual activity. Just to sort of review where we've been, we saw the great deal of ferment and variety going on in medieval spirituality, in terms of scholastic theology and various kinds of spiritualities that were part of the Middle Ages, various institutional things going on, minority spiritualities, and sort of prosecutions over heresy, and eventually witchcraft that went on in the early modern period. Um, and then we saw with the transition into the late Middle Ages, more talk about there. And then the early modern period, looking at that era, we saw the Protestant Reformation break out and the great sifting out of Western European culture between Protestant denominations on the one hand, of various kinds, your Calvinists, your Lutherans, your Anabaptists, your Anglicans, and others, and your Roman Catholics on the other, and the sort of coalescing of the more conservative side of Christianity around Roman Catholicism. Um, so we're kind of picking up from there, moving up to around the middle of the 1600s, and then looking through the 1700s. And this is the area when we talk about the Enlightenment in those terms. A couple of things to bear in mind about it. One is that the Enlightenment was not a single idea. It was not anything that was institutionalized, really, although we'll talk about some social forms of sort of Enlightenment gatherings that were significant to the era. So it's a rather abstruse and various kind of a phenomenon in that sense. It's not something which is going to give rise to any one particular institution or anything like that. And it's not any one idea. There's no one thing necessarily that all Enlightenment thinkers and all Enlightenment influenced people ever really agreed on. Instead, it was more of a shared view of how to think, of the sort of views and opinions and the ways of arguing them that would be acceptable within enlightened circles. Okay, and that brings up the other thing about the Enlightenment to bear in mind. Although one can talk about the late 17th century and 18th century as an age of enlightenment, people at the time, many of them like to characterize it that way. Historians have since. We are also talking about really fairly privileged circles of people within society. It's not necessarily a movement which is covering the entirety of European society. There are people adopting Enlightenment style in many different countries and areas, but it's not necessarily something that necessarily penetrated down into the poorer majority of European society, even within the more privileged classes and the nobility and the merchants and people like that. Not everybody was necessarily all that interested or enthusiastic about the Enlightenment style of doing things. So you want to bear that in mind. Nevertheless, very influential set of thoughts and ideas going on. I'm going to try to do this in some fairly brief, maybe 8 to 10 minute videos. So I'll break it up over a couple of different videos and sort of see how far each one gets. In this one, I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the Enlightenment, or in a sense, the inspiration for Enlightenment thinkers. Where did they come from? Where did these ideas emerge from? And there's really two things going on in the background that bring about the rise of Enlightenment thought. One of them is a disillusionment with the principle that Christianity could form the basis for a unified society. Okay? They're still inheriting from the Middle Ages the idea that maybe there ought to be a unified society. Maybe there ought to be a shared basis on which everybody agreed what was good, what was right, what a proper social order ought to be, what people ought to believe. They still held that basic idea. They haven't really adopted a principle of pluralism necessarily yet. But they had given up on the idea. The Enlightenment sort of spread among people who had given up on the idea that Christianity was ever going to be able to provide that shared basis in the future. Okay, that had sort of been the dream of the Middle Ages, a great unified Reformed Christian society. The Reformation had tried to reform and purify it, but it only wound up splintering things. And you wound up with these conflicting Protestant and Catholic camps persecuting each other, going to war with each other, engaged in endless theological arguments with each other, which nobody seemed to be able to win or come to a conclusion on. And finally, among some thinkers, it arrives at the point of saying maybe there never will be a resolution to this. Maybe no side ever will come out on top winning these wars or winning these arguments. So religion no longer is all that promising as something which is going to provide a unified basis of European culture. Christianity is not, what could? And that comes to the second thing, which is the excitement and the enthusiasm for developments in the physical sciences, things we talked about in the previous unit when we saw the new heliocentric model of the universe overthrowing the Ptolemaic universe, Copernicus and Galileo coming along, eventually Isaac Newton, with all these new scientific theories and scientific observations, new scientific methods starting to get developed, which was just astonishing to intellectuals for the way that problems in astronomy and physics that had been or seemed intractable for centuries and just unsolvable had been overturned and new ideas had come along by people who had disregarded the traditions inherited from the ancient authorities, the great ancient writers like Ptolemy and Aristotle and these other thinkers, and people who had instead used their own observation of nature and thought about it with the use of reason and wound up developing this entirely new theory. And so you get this kind of an inspiration from the physical sciences that maybe that same method could be fruitful if you applied it on a broader basis. If you had people who would reflect on nature using reason alone in disregarding ancient authorities, you've been educated in those authorities, but kind of setting those aside, then maybe you could arrive at a basis of knowledge which would not depend on any particular religious tradition, would not depend on any particular institution or hierarchy, would not depend on personal opinions or personal faith or anything like that, would not depend on authority coming down from a pope or anyone, but rather that intelligent people using their reason to reflect on nature could arrive at truth. And if everybody would just do this, then we could arrive at a universal truth that everybody would agree on, and that would unite everybody. So that sort of combination of disillusionment with the possibility that religion was going to provide that unity, together with the inspiration that maybe the scientific method that was being developed in areas like astronomy could provide that basis, really is sort of the motivating factor for the Enlightenment. And out of that, you can also see then sort of what you really ought to ingrain into your mind as the sort of two shared principles of the Enlightenment, right? There's no one theory or idea or belief that all Enlightenment people agree on, but what they did agree on, what made them see each other and acknowledge one another as part of the Enlightenment, was this idea that the truth would come from human reason reflecting on nature, right? And reason and nature are going to be your mantras, so to speak. It's a word from India, so it didn't apply in Western Europe at the time, but sort of the terms that get referred to repeatedly, very often sort of capitalized in the writings of Enlightenment philosophers. Reason and nature. Nature thought of the way the scientists do, something that you study, something that you observe. This could include human nature. And then reason, just by sort of applying logic to it in the without assistance of or depending on authority or tradition or any of these other factors. So that's kind of the Enlightenment very much in a nutshell. In the next video, I'll talk about a few specific applications of it, but I'll stop there for the moment.